time to ditch the excuses. Get up, get out, and shut the f*** up. This is the Adjusting to Six Figures podcast.
Yeah, well, the podcast kind of started before everything else I'm doing right now. I started this show back in 2015 after failing at just about any career you could imagine. After I was a high school teacher for a couple of years, wasn't very happy. Did network marketing for a little bit. Sold products on the internet.
How was that?
Oh, I have a bunch of people that don't talk to me anymore after doing that. That was kind of the interesting experience. So you hate your life. Yeah. I got this thing. You should buy it. So I did that for a little bit. I sold products online for a little bit, but I left my promo code to get a discount, a 90% discount on my product on my listing, and lost all of my products in about 20 minutes. Wow. So my entrepreneurial journey ended pretty quickly, and I actually started the podcast just as a hobby, and we had 10,000 listens in our first month, and that actually led to the business
in your first month.
Yeah.
Wow. How did you manage 10,000 listens? Did you already have
I had no following whatsoever. I was just kind of so I'd had a podcast in 2014, the beginning of that year, called Rock Your Life. And it was the worst thing any human being had ever created. And it was just, Am I allowed to curse? I don't know. Am I allowed to cuss on this or?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It was fucking atrocious. It was so bad. And I feel like the F word is the only thing that can describe that. It was just so bad. And when I started Create Your Own Life in the middle of 2015, I'm like, okay, well, if I'm going to do it this time, I know number one, it's going to take a lot of work getting it out to people because I had no social following. So it was going to take a lot of work getting it out to people. It was going to get people to subscribe, was going to be the main thing, getting them to review and kind of doing anything I could possibly do. So it was emailing, text messaging, grabbing people's phones and showing them how to do it. I did whatever I could to get it in front of people because I had failed in my mind. I had failed so bad the first time. I was like, well, what's the worst that could happen? It just doesn't work again.
I've been telling, we just started doing a podcast. I just started doing a podcast middle of last year. Mm-hmm. And I have been suggesting so many friends of mine, so many people that I've worked with just to start a podcast. It's honestly one of the more, out of all the things that I do, out of all the stresses that I have throughout the day, and don't get me wrong, having a podcast has its own list of stresses. Oh, yeah. This is honestly one of the most, this is the funner part of my day, is just having to work by taking a break and talking to somebody for 30 minutes, 60 minutes, 90 minutes about whatever they're knowledgeable about. Mm-hmm. And you learn so much in the process. To me, but and the one biggest thing is just trying to get as much people to listen as possible. Because that's what validates your skill as a podcaster, right? That's your listener count.
Well, what's interesting about that though is early on, I had a lot of good guests, which is great, but I feel like eventually you get this shift in the subjects you're talking about. You want them to be ones, at least it was for me. I don't know if everybody's like that. It's these subjects that really matter. And I found that when you start reaching out to guests, you're very particular, number one, about who you reach out to. But number two, when you start reaching out to those people, you don't really talk about numbers or anything like that anymore. You know what I mean? I feel like early on, you're this is how many listens I have. And this is where we're going. This is where we publish, please be a part of my show. And what I found for me when I started kind of pivoting to more of what I care about, I would reach out to people with a very particular thing I want to talk to them about, how I want to talk to them about, how it fits with what I'm doing. And we don't really talk about numbers anymore. And it's interesting because that's actually where more growth has come, is when I stopped worrying so much about the numbers. It may sound a little ridiculous, but that was actually where the bigger growth came from.
Right. I mean, because it's about when you manage to kind of sell somebody on your podcast, being a guest on your podcast, you can really connect with them more in a way if you have some sort of common ground. Mm-hmm. And you think that your podcast following would really benefit from, whatever content, whatever book that they have, whatever message that they're putting out there. If you truly believe that and you're capable of communicating that to that potential guest, the numbers doesn't matter.
Yes.
Because they're already sold on the benefit of just coming on the podcast. That's the way. And that is something that I personally have just recently really started figuring out on my own.
It's interesting too, and like I don't know where you stand politically, and I don't want to get political about it, but like I interviewed Seth Dillon not long ago from the Babylon Bee, and I had reached out to him from the perspective of like, I think we're in a weird place right now where society can't laugh at itself anymore, and I wrote this really long email to him about like, like this isn't about making a political statement, this isn't about like picking left or right, but I just want to talk about what it says about a society when we can't laugh anymore and the purpose of gestures in society. So he writes me back. He's like, first of all, he's like, nobody's ever written me anything like that before. That was super cool. And number two, let's talk about that. And that's the uniqueness of like how you pitch somebody, And
you're absolutely right on that. We can't laugh. There's so much that we can't laugh at.
It's sad, man.
Anymore.
It really is.
It's one of the rough. We live today in one of the most polarizing societies. Clearly, that we have ever been a part of, I believe. And just recently, I mean, we're talking about podcasts, all this stuff that has gone on with Joe Rogan and his podcast. And that's all tied into how COVID has been politicized, and also the we can't laugh.
It's interesting because like here's an example of that. Like just like I'm a huge movie fan. Like I watch too many movies, and my wife hates watching them with me because I know every line to them after I see them once. Tropic Thunder is one of my favorite movies. I think it was one of the greatest movies ever created. You could not make that movie in 2022 because too many people would be offended.
Right, you can't. You can't do blackface anymore.
Well, I don't think that was ever acceptable. But I mean, like a lot of stuff in that movie is just like, woof, you can't say that.
Right. It's interesting. It's so interesting, and to go, and it's even more. It makes me think: at what point is Robert Downey Jr. going to be canceled for his role in that movie?
It's surprising that's actually never come up now that you pointed out. Like I've never heard anybody say anything about that, at least modernly.
Right. And I mean, to connect it with Joe Rogan. So Joe Rogan, his podcast, full disclosure, his podcast is really the one podcast that kind of got me into podcasts.
Oh, cool.
I started listening to that, when it first came out, and they were selling rubber vaginas in the beginning of their, podcast. But I don't listen to it as much anymore. I've got a lot of things going on.
Sure.
I listened to bits and pieces of Jordan Peterson when he had Jordan Peterson on as a guest. But it's so they came out with that clip. Somebody took the time out of their day to, put that clip together of him dropping the N-word a whole bunch of times. They don't. They certainly don't use the don't elaborate on the context that it was used. Yeah. And if anybody really dug deeper into that, they would see that he's not calling anybody the N-word or using it in a derogatory way. He's just using the word itself. Right. So if whatever you want to call it, cancel culture, that's that segment of the society can use that as a means to cancel someone. Why not look at a guy like Robert Downey Jr. and say, you're a racist because you agreed to do that movie, and blackface is racist in any way, even if you didn't mean it. It's
a very weird position to be in right now. And I don't know if you noticed with Rogan as well, there was an issue this morning, actually. It was trending on Twitter for a little bit that his whole feed disappeared for a couple hours today. And it's back now, but it's like there was like trending on Twitter. It's like Joe Rogan disappears from Spotify, and if you search for it, it just came up and it said show cannot be found. I just think there's some more funny business going on over there around that, and it's weird, right? Because it's like he talks to people on the right, he talks to people on the left, he talks to people in the middle. It's whatever it is. He just has kind of looked at what you can and can't talk about. And he's like, you know what? I just want to talk about it and learn. And that's why I think podcasting and where we are right now is such an incredible place to be in, because it's one of the kind of the last bastions of free speech, or one of the last places you can talk about your mind, man. Like if you want to cuss, go for it. If you don't, that's fine too. But we can actually have long form discussions on things where we can learn some real things about people. Like, you know what I mean? You really learn about somebody when you hear the long form conversations.
And the cost of entry is incredibly low. I mean, you could do it with an iPhone. I mean, it's going to suck, but it's not going to be great, but you can start one. If you have an opinion, you can start a podcast. And if there are other people with like-minded opinions and they like who you are, they like your personality, they like your delivery and all that, you have a medium, you have a platform for yourself. You don't have to be subject to, people on, Don Lemon, or people on CNN or Fox or wherever. You can find someone that's a bit more unhinged. You could say you could find somebody. I
don't even know if it's unhinged. I feel like it's they're a lot of times unless they're on a network, they're more in control of their content. Like they decide what sponsors they want. They decide what sponsors they don't want. They decide what subjects they want to talk about. They decide what subjects they don't want to talk about. Whereas, a lot of it with big media, man, just comes down to money, right? Like it comes down to money. Right. Like even, I remember, when I kind of first got into the PR world, when I kind of learned that most things you see on even the nightly news are just kind of packaged PR things that somebody paid for. And you're like, wait, that news story wasn't like, it was real, but like they weren't looking for it. Once you kind of get a look behind the curtain, you kind of get a little shocked on like what the actual news world looks like and what gets covered. So to me, I think you're seeing people that are less bought and paid for in the podcast world. And that kind of goes to either side, right? Because you have, big companies on this side and big companies on that side, and they're paying for stuff. But that's really what it comes down to with mainstream news, man, is somebody's paying for it. Right.
And so what was your background in PR?
So, well, our company, Command Your Brand, is a PR firm that focuses on podcasts. So one of the things that we did was actually we got me on other shows when I first launched the show back in 2015, and it was so successful. People were like, hey, can you help me with that? So we actually started doing book launches and product launches and PR campaigns and things like that. And we've been focusing solely on podcasts. And it's been really cool for, a lot of the, the clients and things like that we've had. But initially, I also had a big background in like print PR and things like that. And my wife's been in that space for a very long time, since I think for about like 12 or 13 years now. So I had an idea on how you get on these different TV stations, how you do different stuff, because, I've had those appearances. So it's once you kind of understand how a lot of that stuff works, that usually they're not looking for you. You have to, number one, get it in front of, or number two, it's a paid piece. Like so much stuff is paid for play now. It's kind of crazy.
Right. I've personally had some offers come in for different magazines, and, pay, I don't remember what it was, pay $1,000 and you'll show up on 5 magazines that you've never heard
and
of.
Nobody reads.
It's got a Angel Fire webpage. It's awful.
Angel Fire in GeoCities, right?
Yep. So for the listeners, I mean, because I didn't understand this until quite some time. So when you talk about PR, public relations, if you are, I guess any regular Joe, or you're a business, what is PR to you? What does PR do for you at that point? Could you explain that?
Well, it's communicating to your public. So a public is just like a specialized term that means a type of audience. So it's you're communicating to the people you want to hear you. And it's the idea of it is you want them to know who you are, have some affinity for you and actually trust you. And that's why you do PR. Is it's a lot of times people confuse it with marketing. And, marketing is something a lot of times, the more, if it works well, the more you pay for, the more you should get, right? Like in terms of marketing. But with PR, there isn't always at the end like this dollar value you can do, right? But it's that know, like, and trust factor that, okay, if people know who you are better, well, your ads are going to convert at a higher rate. If people know who you are, they're going to tell other people about you. So like, it's kind of this thing that has this nebulous way to measure, but if you're not doing it, everything else you're doing doesn't work well. So it's that know, like, and trust factor, and kind of creating the ability for people to trust you so that they will click on that ad, so they will spend more money with you than they will in somebody else. And there's so much value in it, but most people don't actually understand that's how it works.
When should a business really start to consider?
Day one.
The PR asset. Day one.
But the thing is there's different ways that everybody should be going about it. The thing that I think every business should do from day one is something that I like to call a small pond strategy. And that's where you locate the
what is it? What is that
small
called?
Pond strategy. I just kind of like made it up, but like it works. Trust me.
Okay.
It's not like this big grand, like there's a book written on it theory, but like it works. If you think about it this way, like everybody has a small pond that they're a big fish in somewhere, right? It may be your town. It may be the community you live in. Like if you're in a city, maybe there's a section of that city, right? Like there's Brooklyn in New York, or there's different parts of Brooklyn even. Like, you know what I mean? So there's different places that you are a big fish. It could be your church. It could be your university. So a lot of those places have publications. And like I even lived in a lake community for a while, and they had this beautiful full color magazine that went to every house in the 2 communities around it. And when you're, kind of more of a local business, PR is actually much easier to get because number one, most people aren't thinking about it. And number two, there's a small pond you're a big fish in. What that means is there's less competition for you because it's a smaller space. And a lot of times we used to have this small weekly newspaper that went to my house in the town I grew up in. Every house in the county got it on a Thursday. And since like the town was 5/8 of my own size, nothing really happened there. So anything was news. So what happens is you wrote a press release and you got it to them by a Tuesday, they run it in the paper on Thursday. And that paper also had an online component. And because it's a trusted news source, it also showed up in Google News. So now you'd get a Google News hit, it'd show up online, which would backlink to your website, and you're in the paper version. So it's not, the New York Times or the Washington Post or like one of these big things, but you're starting to create backlinking to your site and people that know you. And you can actually take some of those pieces now and put them on what's called a media page in your site, a page in your site where you list all these things. So we did that with the local paper. We did that with the regional papers. We did that with the magazine that my university sent around once a month. So there's all these different places that you can start to get attention, create backlinks to your site, create media pieces so that you build credibility and you can have some stuff to actually show. And that was how I got my first TV appearance. That was how I got a lot of the early newspaper appearances. Is you just get a press release in the smallest publication you can think of, and gradually keep building up from that.
Wow, I've heard of that before. How you got to do these press releases, and I've heard for years. Yeah. I've heard about press releases and putting press releases out there, but I've always wondered who the hell reads these press releases. Where does this even go?
So you have to be strategic with it, because I think, first of all, a lot of people have the wrong idea on what a press release means. Like a press release is supposed to be for other media to read, to want to write about you or feature you. I think a lot of people think press release and they think that's the news article. It's not. You're telling people that there's a piece of news they should be interested in and they should want to write about or do a segment on. So you see these press release services, people are like, get it in 3,000 different newspapers and blah, blah, blah. And it's on their website for 7 days and nobody sees it. You're actually going to get more of an advantage by finding regional, small, and local newspapers, because people in those areas will read them. Here's an example. When we hit 50,000 downloads on my podcast, in the grand scheme of things, not a big deal. But outside of the podcast world, especially in 2017, people are like, wow, that sounds like a lot of people listening. So when we wrote a press release, local podcaster hits 50,000 download milestone, wrote a 2-paragraph article. It ran in the local paper, the Bergen Record. A producer for New York Channel 1 read that release in the newspaper and said, oh, podcasting, we should talk about that. They did a television segment on it, and that's how I ended up on TV. The purpose of a press release is to get more media. It's not the media piece itself, but a lot of people have this weird idea that it is.
That's what I thought, that it's the media piece
itself. It's not. It's how to get more media. Yeah.
So you said you got a TV spot.
Yes.
Out of the deal. What was that? What station? What did you even talk about? You talk about podcast on there?
So they were featuring like interesting and different business concepts. It was on New York Channel 1. And so that's like the local, TV access type station. So it wasn't a huge station, but it was my first piece. And they did a nice job with it. But they were looking at different and interesting types of jobs and careers and stuff like that people wouldn't really know about. So they interviewed me about what is a podcast? How does that work? How do you get guests? What do you talk to them about? So it was different because people weren't really aware of podcasts. And I think when people think of media, they have this idea that the media is looking for them, when a lot of times the news cycle, there's so many things happening that there's nobody out there really looking for you. You have to realize that you have to be the one to tell your story and get it out there to people. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is you have to think of what's newsworthy. Just existing isn't newsworthy. And that's what you're mentioning, the people that reach out to you like, hey, pay $1,000 and we'll put you in these 5 publications. they're literally just taking a press release and shooting it out to a service like, Yahoo Finance or like one of those. And when actuality, it should be like, what's newsworthy about what I'm doing? So what that means is what's particularly interesting. Are you a veteran? Like, that's interesting. Did you hit some milestone? That's interesting. Are you doing something to help the community? That's interesting. So you always want to find out what's newsworthy. Like, why should people care about what you're doing? And then you actually have something people are going to be interested in.
Wow. How'd you figure this out?
My wife's a genius. I have a master's degree in ancient history, man. So like, I didn't figure this out through going to school. As I said, I started the podcast, and my wife's degree is actually in public relations. And I had the podcasting angle on things. And a lot of what she did in promoting the show, I got good at myself, learned how to do. And that's, the company came from taking her knowledge and my podcasting knowledge and putting it together. So I learned all this stuff because she knew it, and then I learned how to do it on the internet.
That's how you do it. Yeah. Oh man, that's far out. Let me dial back for a second because I'm curious. So you said you did you were into MLM before. And until all your that
was my first business when I didn't know my head from my ass.
Yeah, that's a lot of people's. It's a great
boot camp.
I mean, it's easy to get it. Yeah, it's a great boot camp. I mean, you learn sales right there. You learn sacrifice, right? So, what happened? Did you go from doing, from MLM, network marketing, for those that don't know, not working out, and then you switched over to the podcast deal? Like, how did all of that evolve?
Well, I guess let's go a little further back, so it just doesn't sound like I'm some person that started MLM in high school. So as I mentioned,
I think I did. I think I started.
Did you?
MLM
Okay, well, go for it, man.
Pretty sure.
More power to you. I'm actually a nerd that had to learn about business. Like my master's degree is in ancient history, so I came out and I was actually teaching high school for a couple of years. And I wasn't super happy. And in 2012, my mom ended up having actually a really bad stroke. And it was really, really, really difficult on my family. And I kind of looked at my career choice and I'm like, so let me get this straight. I'm miserable every day. I hate my job. Students now have these things called cell phones and they're putting me on the YouTubes. So every day I'd go to work and they'd see how angry can we get him and get him on video. And my fuse is this long. Right. So that was every day of my life. My blood pressure must have been up here. So I just wasn't very happy. And my wife was shown this network marketing opportunity, which neither of us, first of all, knew what network marketing was. So I thought this company wanted me to get a job with them and do all this stuff. And I'm like, wow, this is so cool. I'm going to make $1 million in 3 days. Oh my God. Why isn't everybody doing this? So I called the principal and I'm like, I started a business and I quit. And he's like, you are insane. So I did that for about 3 years or so, alienated every single person I'd ever met, made some really good money, and learned that I didn't like myself very much because any public interaction I went into, I'd be like, so don't like that career, huh? I got this thing.
Right.
You should get in. So I don't know, all of my social interactions started to feel weird and I just didn't like it anymore. And I actually ended up quitting that and selling life insurance, which I was good at. And it taught me not to be afraid of the phone, first of all, because I was making 150 phone calls a day. You just dial for dollars there. And I just didn't like those conversations of talking about death all the time. It just wasn't, fun. And my last grasp then was I was like, okay, so you can buy products from China really cheap, sell them on Amazon for way too much money, and make money. I'm like, great, I'm in. So I was learning how to buy products from China, private label them, put your own label on them and sell them on Amazon.
Right.
And then one of the things you do when you get started is you sell them for $1 to get the sales volume up and climb up the rankings so you sell more products. But there's a little checkbox that says, put my promo code on my listing. So I didn't uncheck that. So somebody realized that I was giving all my products away for $1 the day I launched my product, and I was out of business in 20 minutes.
Wow. they call that's the Amazon FBA.
Yeah, fulfillment by Amazon. Yep.
Right. Wow.
So then I started the podcast because everything else didn't work. I'm like, well, I've been a listener since 2007 when it was still books in the public domain that were on there. It was like LibriVox is one of the big ones. People would record themselves reading books and put them on podcasts. And I just like, all right, I'll start a podcast. And as I said, the first one kind of sucked. The second one was great. And, that's kind of what's led me to here.
Man, I remember we're about the same age. I think the first podcast I ever listened to, do you remember, it was like a software called, do you remember Winamp?
No.
Do you know what I'm talking about?
Like I remember LibriVox, which was like the public domain. And like they had like, what was the other one? It was like Apple had like, you could listen to like colleges, like different like lectures and stuff like that.
They've come such a long way because I remember this Winamp. I'm pretty sure that's what it was called. It's just a Windows-based application. You would usually put your MP3s on there.
Like,
and make
I remember this. Like it was like Real Player back in the day.
Exactly. Yes, like Real Player, but fuck Real Player. This was like way cooler. You got skins and stuff like that.
I remember this thing. Now I forgot about the skins.
Yeah. Yeah, you download from Napster or Kazaa or Morpheus, and then you bring it over there.
This was even before LimeWire then, so this is way back there, man.
Right, it's OG shit, not that LimeWire, man. That's later. But I remember at a certain point they started having, they didn't call it podcasts. It was just internet radio, something like that. Me and a buddy who I started this podcast with, Chris Stanley, we would do these podcasts and we were like the Jerky Boys back in the day. We didn't have anything. We were just getting high in a back room, prank phone calling people, and we got listeners. It was amazing. But yeah, and so many years later, I mean, it's kind of amazing that regular terrestrial radio is still hanging on there.
I've always had the idea, and I don't know if I'm right on this, but I've always had the idea that the only thing that's got terrestrial radio holding on is the automotive industry.
100%.
You know what I mean? Because I know, even right out of college, I was like painting houses when I first graduated, and even then, that was either CDs or people were starting to do MP3s and early podcasts. Like they weren't listening to the radio anymore on job sites. So I think if they if radios ever, came out of cars, like let's say somebody wanted to do that, I think that would be the death of radio, in my opinion.
It would be. Who else is listening to the radio? I mean, other than if you're, other than if you're on a job site, right? And even if you're on a job site, usually nobody's coming to you and say, hey, I know we got these CDs, but let's listen to the radio today. Nobody's saying that shit, to listen to the same top, 40, but, they're only going to play the top, 15 on a loop.
Oh my gosh.
Nobody wants to hear that
Our
shit.
Local radio station here, we've had the same local radio station since I can remember, since the early 90s. I'm convinced they own one CD. And on it is the song Black Velvet and 5 other songs, and that's it. Black Velvet. And that's all they play all day.
I get upset with Sirius XM too, because even, they have tons of stations. They have they do have, if you force me to choose between radio and Sirius XM, I take Sirius XM, 7 days out of the week. But damn, some of their stations too, man, it's just the same playlist just going over and over and over again.
I canceled my satellite radio. I haven't had it in years. I pretty much just do podcasts, audiobooks. Then I do love Spotify just because I have so many different playlists on there. Right. But yeah, that's pretty much it, man.
And despite all of it, radio's hung on. You're right. If
I don't know how true that is, but it feels pretty true to me.
It has to be. Who else has a radio? I don't have a radio. Just laying around somewhere to turn it up.
I remember, I don't know if you remember, I don't know what part of the country you're in, but in New Jersey, you had if we had really bad snow days, you'd have to have this battery powered radio that you could turn it on and so you could check the local station and see if your schools were closed. I don't even know how I would actually listen to the radio at my house. I actually don't know how I would.
I'll tell you this. I went, I think about a year or so ago, I went to a drive-in movie theater. And I had totally forgot. So I went to a drive-in movie theater in a pickup truck, right? I had this whole thing. Listen, I was going to get.
We put the chairs in the bed and stuff and back in and everything. Yep.
Right.
That's the way to do it.
Here's what I did. I got the bed truck and I put a blow up mattress there. I filled it up before I left. I put pillows there. I loaded the whole thing. It was great. I was going to get high as shit and watch something. And I pulled in there. Now my truck does not have a sliding window that divides the cab from the bed. Right?
Oh no! So you couldn't hear the radio.
Couldn't hear shit.
No audio.
So then, right. And then I'm like, fuck, what do I do? How do I handle this? And so I spent probably the first hour of the movie just trying to figure out how to get the radio on my phone, which seems like
you should be able to, but here's the interesting thing about it. The FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, has a regulation on cell phones so that they aren't supposed to be able to do basic radio, even though they actually have that functionality in them. Go figure.
Well, that makes sense because that was a fucking boring movie. I'll tell you that. So it may, I mean, come on, radio, step up. You had a customer at a non-paying customer at a certain point to listen to whatever ads you've got going on for whatever local law firm is needing some personal injury clients.
Gosh, it's like I think of we have friends and family in like the Tampa area, and I think of every time you drive down that main highway in Florida, and just every billboard is a lawyer for auto injury or something like that. It's like, Jesus, man.
Yeah, that's those Florida people, man. You gotta watch out for them. So so with the PR side, let me ask you: so with PR, I mean, how do I want to word this? What platforms do you work out of? I mean, are you handling PR just for like online, newspapers, or I mean, do you go everywhere? You're doing TV?
So we used to do a lot of different stuff, but we literally only focus on like podcast guest appearances now. The reason being is I find like number one, I just think it's a way to really have a great conversation and like learn a lot about somebody, which is incredible. And number two, like we've been talking about like radio dying here. I think it's where people are going now. Like I don't think you're seeing as many people watching morning shows. Like actually, I don't know anybody that watches a morning show on some of these channels and whatnot. So I think to me, podcasts are where the media is going. And that's why we're doing, book launches by getting people on podcasts and trust campaigns by getting people on podcasts. Because number one, you're getting to hang out with some incredible people, in the hosts, right? Like you meet some cool people that way, right. But then also you're getting in front of the right type of audiences of people that want to hear you, and they're hearing you for 30 minutes, 40 minutes, an hour, whatever it may be. And like for my own show, like sometimes we have interviews that go an hour and a half, and you're not getting that in any other place. If you're on the radio, you're getting 6 minutes, you're getting 30-second clips, like whatever it is. People can't know you. You know what I mean?
Right. You're not getting depth.
Yes.
You're not getting depth whatsoever. And not to jump back on his balls, but that's one reason why I love the Joe Rogan podcast. And personally, I don't know how the fuck he does it because I can't.
I couldn't hold a conversation for 3 hours, man.
Hell no, man. If I hit an hour, I'm like, whoo, this is a success. I can't believe I did it. Hour and a half. They did the one I mentioned before, Jordan Peterson.
It's like 4 hours.
4 hours.
I couldn't get through the first 40 minutes, man. Like, I don't know. I found that one tougher to listen to. I like Jordan Peterson. I found that one tough to listen to because it just kind of seemed like they were going nowhere early on.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. And that is what makes it. And I'll tell you this going on that. Now you got me on a rant. Now it's tough. Being a podcast host, like a good one, is tough.
Yes.
I'm far from great, but just like anything else, every podcast I learn a little bit more, and I'm better with the guests and everything like that. But I look at a podcast like Rogan and Peterson, if a listener has never heard of Jordan Peterson,
sounds like Kermit the Frog.
Definitely look up Jordan Peterson. It's an incredibly intellectual person, psychologist, I think is his title. Very smart person to listen to. Very thought-provoking person. That being said, got to make sure you're at a pretty intellectual level to really be able to digest anything that guy says, especially when he's on a roll.
And I'll tell you, as a host, that's one of the really tough things because I've been interviewing like a lot of doctors recently because I've like wanted to understand like the science behind COVID and all the kind of the stuff happening. And I find like the thing that's really hard is getting them to slow down and like define things. So like as a host, that can be one of the hardest things is number one, just not to agree with them. To be like, okay, well, you just use that. What does that mean? Let's take a look at that. And I find that can be one of the hardest parts of being a host, man.
Yeah, and because you don't want to be rude.
Yeah.
And personally, and this is a terrible habit of mine. This is a very good point, because a terrible habit of mine that I carry in real life while I'm in a conversation is, if somebody's talking and they're trying to get to a point and they're going and going and going, I would rather not slow the conversation down to ask, wait, can you explain this further? And can we just, pump the brakes, as if we have a whole hour reserved of our time? I'll just smile and say, oh, yeah, yeah. And I'll try my best to, connect some dots as we go along. But by doing that as a podcast, so it's really kind of putting your podcast listeners at a disadvantage, because they probably don't fucking know what the person's talking about either. It's,
and I'll
that's
tell you,
that's
one of the biggest complaints I get from like our YouTube subscribers. Like, you cut off your guests too much. And it's like, okay, but like, they just explain something that's really, really intricate. If we don't stop it, other people aren't going to be listening, and then we can continue. But like unpacking it, like you don't want to get too far, and then you got to unpack the whole thing because people may not get it yet. And
that's, and just going back to what we were saying with Jordan Peterson, man, just as a podcast host, if somehow, some way Jordan Peterson's listening to this and he decides he wants to come on the Adjusting to Six Figures podcast, I'll have him any day.
Yeah, but I meant no offense by the Kermit the Frog comment, but he does kind of sound like him.
He meant all the offense.
No, I did not.
Come this way. But after 30 minutes of that, man, just, knocking in 8-syllable words after, word after word, I need to just sit and think, what did I...
Yeah.
Where are we?
Well, and I think that's one of the hardest things, because like I said, I've been interviewing a lot of doctors, a lot of people in that area, and the one woman we were going to talk to is, I had heard an interview she'd done with Dr. Mercola recently, and I'm like, so listen, you are probably the smartest person I have ever spoken to. I'm not that smart, so I'm going to do my best to make this make sense for regular people. And she goes, okay, let's do that.
That's what makes a great host. It's, you're being a host for the listener, not just, for yourself. It's not a recorded video call, which is the, most important thing that I personally still try to figure out today. How many episodes in your podcast are you?
962 or something like that. I think we're at
962. I think that's what I saw.
962. I think was our latest one.
Man. So you're zeroing in.
We're closing in, man. We're almost up to 1,000. We're like 38 away.
When was your first episode? How long you been doing
November 20th of 2015 was the first episode. And that was, as I said, the second time around. Okay. The first one was in 2014. And it was like me kind of like sound like a life coach without a microphone. So it was kind of like it was like if you listen to a podcast delivered by the adults on Charlie Brown. It was that bad.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's been a long time, man. Like it's been 6+ years at this point in time. And for me, I personally feel like I've only really started to become a better interview in the last year, frankly. Like it just takes a lot of work of like continually working at it,
Why do you think that is? Or why do you think it took you so long?
Because I think early on I was uncomfortable with interviews. So I did what everybody does. You come up with the same scripted questions that you ask every single person, because you're like, okay, well, at least the structure is here and I can make this last 30 minutes and we're good to go. Whereas now, like I come up with like 3 to 5, not even questions, kind of like bullet points or thoughts. And, I realized that the follow-up questions that you ask to those is actually where the really, really good conversation comes in. So you have some idea of structure, you have some background, but you're really looking to converse more. And that's why episodes are, they're going 45 minutes, an hour, hour and a half. And we're really diving deep into topics where I feel like my goal is for somebody that's got, a high school level education to walk away from what I'm saying and say, I understand this. I agree with it or I don't agree with it, but I at least now I feel like I can make a decision on the subject you've talked about. And that's really what I'm looking to do. And I think early on it was over preparing. It was too structured. I tried to sound too smart, and really it was learning how to interview better and just make what I'm doing communicate to people.
I agree with all of that. My biggest thing was, and I've have a couple episodes like this. I have a few episodes where I've gotten overly salesy for the guest.
Ooh, that can be tough.
It's disgusting. I've thought about I have a few episodes where I've thought about removing them just because I'm thankful to have a guest on, and they have something that they're pushing. And I'm like, oh, so tell me about this. Tell me more about this. Tell me more. And eventually I feel like, I'm freaking white Flava Flav. I'm just hyping them up. And it's
Billy Mays here. You're listening to the Adjusting to Six Figures podcast.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. And I'm going to sell somebody else's shit in the process. It's awful. So let me ask you this. All right. Cause you got the PR thing, right? You got the podcast thing. All right. So when you're working with I'm just trying to like wrap my head around everything. So when you get a client, right? What is the client coming to you and asking for?
They're usually looking. So number one, they've heard about podcasts and they're like, well, how do I capitalize off that world? Or they're launching a book or a product and they're trying to get it in more people's hands. So that's typically why they're coming to us. They're already successful. They're already doing well, but they have a bigger, broader message they're trying to get out to the right people. And they're just looking at it and they're like, well, it's a new space. I don't know a ton about it. You guys know what you're doing. And, I'd rather just have you do it for me. So we help them with like getting their messaging down, with getting all of their media pieces, like their, one pagers or talking points, all those things that they're going to need so they can approach this the right way. And then we really run a campaign of getting them booked on the right shows. But getting them in front of the right audience, getting them to talk about things the right way, getting them to send people to the right place, like those are really, really vital to a successful campaign. So there's going to be different reasons that people come to us, but typically they're looking to take advantage of the podcast space and have some great conversations. They just don't know how to do it.
You said you're helping them get set up for the podcast and getting them on other podcasts.
So we don't
Did I hear that?
Like if they want to start a podcast, that's cool, but we don't support them in that. Like we have some courses and stuff that teach that, but we're really, the service for helping them get on other shows.
Oh, okay.
As well as like coaching them on what to say and how to say it, right? What questions to ask and what things to do and how to actually show up. Like, cause that stuff is vital. You could get on the right show, but if you kind of just like get up there and just screw it up, there's kind of no point either. So like we go over a lot of that stuff too.
Right. Wow. So that's interesting. Cause I've formed a lot of opinions on that over the last year. And
they send you the worst pitches ever. And they usually like, give somebody else's first name in your pitch.
Man, yeah, that's awful. That's atrocious.
Yeah. I'm a podcaster. I get it.
I'll tell you what. The one thing I hate is just
they leave the name tags in for their email marketing software. Hey, first name fix. How you doing?
Oh my gosh. No, I work with companies that do that too. It's mind blowing. It's made me want to start a marketing company so I can take over their freaking Constant Contact for $2,500 a month.
Constant Contact is the worst email software ever created because it was built in like 2000.
And I want to say this because we have a lot of listeners that are in the insurance space, and insurance and property insurance and things like that. And property insurance is like 2 decades behind everything. Man, there are still a good handful of these insurance companies and the vendors that work under them that are still on Constant Contact. They're still using it. And when I personally, I'm sure this isn't with everybody, but when I personally see that I received an email from Constant Contact and it's from your company, I'm immediately judging you. I immediately know you suck.
Or you're like in like industrial machinery or something like that. Like one of those things where they like just discovered what a computer is. Right.
Yeah. And they got their fax number printed on it. Man. So getting back to the podcast.
I've actually considered starting a podcast where I actually read the bad pitches I get. And then I thought about it. I'm like, but I get too many of my good guests from great PR agencies. Maybe that wouldn't be such a good idea.
Really? Yeah. Man, I what drives me nuts. It's just, and I'm going to say this, but we've recently had this happen on the show, and I'm sure we're going to have it happen again. It's the back equipment's one thing.
Yeah.
And I get if, you're starting out, you don't want to go balls to the wall and get a $500 mic or whatever this thing cost. And, all the, stuff in the background. Yeah. But at least be in a quiet room. At least be in a quiet room with, some sort of background. I mean, come on. You got to imagine if you're lucky enough, right, where somebody's going to be watching or listening to you, which is the goal.
Yes.
You wouldn't appear on that podcast if you didn't want people to know you and to learn from you, to see you and to learn from you, right? You're trying to go against, battle against obscurity here, right? You're trying to build a following or whatever your objective is. Do yourself a favor. Look behind you. Look behind you and look what it looks like and think, well, based on the other videos that I've watched.
You look like you're in the movie Boiler Room. Then you may not want to be on a podcast.
Have a background, be in an area where it looks like the person that's watching you thinks that there is something to learn from you. And that's my biggest thing. I recently
I'm big on sound. And not meaning like everybody has to have studio quality sound, but if there's like this, like, if there sounds like somebody's got a fan going in the background or something like that, like we got to handle that. Cause like your very first, you have to understand most podcasts are audio only. A lot of us do video now and that's great, but most podcasts are audio only. So your biggest barrier is some sort of audio disturbance when you get on a podcast. If that's on there, people are going to stop listening. Like I had this dude on once and conversation wasn't that great. And, I in the background, I could hear an airplane flying and I'm like, dude, come on. Can we just like go inside? Like, can we? And he's like, oh, if you had a good editor that can handle that. I'm like, whoa, dude, calm down. So then we get to the end and I'm like, okay, so, where can people find you? I appreciate your time today. He's like, Google me. And that was the end of it. I'm like,
all right,
not publishing this one. So it's like,
you heard it, folks.
You heard it
Google
here.
him.
Fuck that guy. And we're done.
Please tune into my next episode. I promise it'll be better.
I didn't publish that one.
I had a guy, no shit. We were going to have a guest on that was big in real estate flipping. And, I watched, he's got a little bit of an Instagram following. I checked it out and it was an interesting dude. Really, really interesting. I was pretty excited to have him on. And cause I know I'm trying to lean heavier into real estate this year and, I know some things, but I would have a very good organic conversation with somebody that's actively doing this shit. This calls in an active construction site.
Oh no.
On his phone. And I'm thinking, whoa, what made you think that this would be a good idea? I can barely hear you. Nobody's going to want to listen to this for an hour because audio is the biggest thing. You can have shit quality picture.
So I will tell you the thing that was kind of cool. Like, have you heard of Modest Yahoo?
Yeah.
So he was on my show back in like 2016 and like,
get out.
And, it was actually kind of fun because this is, as I said, we talk about how like the phone things are like bad. This was actually kind of fun. So he took it on the phone and he like, you hear him at one point, he like gets in his car and starts driving and he'd like stop and like talk to random people. And he's like, it's my guitar player. He's like, bro, come be on this podcast with me. So it actually ended up being like really fun. He'd like pulled people into it, but that is not your typical experience.
Well, if you get Modest Yahoo, I mean, I would get I haven't listened to Modest Yahoo in a long time, but I would tolerate that from Modest Yahoo.
Yeah. There's some people that can get away with it.
Right. Man, but all right. So just to circle back here, because I know we got to jet in a little bit. So for the people, just to put a bow on this, right? So for the people that are trying to, like I said before, get out of obscurity, to get a message out there, and they just don't know how to do it. They don't know how to contact different podcasts. With truth be told, I have a podcast. I still struggle to contact. We're going to have to talk about this off air. I still struggle to find other good podcasts to be on.
Because that's like the top 5% of podcasts. If you get 100 downloads or more, you're in the top 5% of podcasts. And that's why most people struggle, is because like, I don't want to be a jerk because I love podcasts, but 95% of them aren't going to move the needle for you. You have to be in the top 1% of the top 5% to actually move the needle for you. You know what? That makes perfect sense, because the handful, I have gotten offers before. Mm-hmm. I've been on some podcasts, don't get me wrong. But now, since I started doing this podcast, I feel like nobody else is doing a podcast except the people that have 5 episodes that, and I'll listen to them and I think, and they're going to bring you into the lightning round. Oh,
right. Something like that. And it's like, that's an hour of my time. I don't know if that's really going to be a productive use of my time. It doesn't seem like they're taking it very seriously, but who the hell am I? But I am glad to know that I'm in the 5%.
Yes. Well, if you go to, I think it's listennotes.com, and if you like type in your show name, it'll tell you what percentile your show is in. They can take a look at it, and it'll tell you like the actual percentile of your show.
Oh, wow. Okay. I'm going to check that out. So yeah, I think we're going to need to talk because, I'm always trying to get my face out there. And I always tell everybody that follows, man. I mean, if you're in business for yourself, I mean, even if you're not in business for yourself and you're just an employee somewhere and you want to get ahead, man, obscurity is the killer. Mm-hmm. It's amazing. I'm a freelance insurance adjuster, and, I have a school where I teach others to be the same. And truth be told, I'm not that great at the technical aspect of it. I've learned to be good over time. I've been very active, but what have always been particularly great at is like the sales and marketing aspect of it, finding work and, getting myself out there. And so I tell everybody over and over, you have to get your name out there, get your face out there, get people knowing you, because nobody's going to want to work with you. You're not going to get these opportunities that you think you should be getting if nobody knows who you are.
Well, and so even like just thinking about your advertising out there, right? Like if your advertising out there isn't converting, like just doing more ad spend doesn't make a ton of sense. You know what I mean? Unless you're going to improve how you're doing it.
Right. 100%. And man, a podcast is a great way, because nobody listens to a podcast unless they got a little bit of time, right? A little bit of time to invest. And if you're on there, just like we were saying before, that's that depth. Mm-hmm. People can actually learn who you are, learn what makes you tick, learn about your personality. And then once they do that, then you may have a listener if you have your own podcast. You maybe have a visitor if you have your own website, or you may have, say if you have you're selling a product or service, then they're coming over to you because they already feel like they're connected with you, because you have some sort of commonality. You deliver a message the same way. You remind them of their friend, their parent, and uncle, something like that.
Well, even the perspective too of like, I think one of the things people struggle with when they're on a podcast is they're afraid to like tell people everything they know about what they do, because they're like, oh, somebody's going to learn how to go do it. And it's like, most people are too lazy, or if they're not too lazy, they're looking at it like, all right, well, if you already know what you're doing, why would I throw resources to it? I'll just hire you to do it. So like, I think that's one thing people have to understand too. Like you're on a platform where you can really, really teach. And with doing that, like you're have the ability to create an incredible level of trust.
Jeremy, dang, man, I feel, I'm feeling a little better about this podcast now that I've been talking to you about it. Dude, and I think we do have to hook up. So if anybody's listening and they're thinking, shit, I want to get on some podcasts and start getting my name, which, by the way, before I go any further, I wanted to also say this. I'm not good at the technical aspect of my job. I'm just good at certain parts. But ever since I started really putting myself out there, being a guest on podcasts, having a website, and doing the social media thing, it's interesting how quickly people assume you're an expert, which, truth be told, what is an expert? Depending on how you define it. I had I remember a couple years ago, I fell into a LinkedIn debate on what an expert is, because this person only defined an expert as somebody who the court would define as an expert.
An expert on LinkedIn, man, is whoever comes up with the better nickname and tells more people about it. Like that's what an expert on LinkedIn is. I'm a crypto enthusiast founder troll.
Makes me want to vomit. But people, you put yourself out there and people just sort of connect that this person wouldn't be out there unless they were a knowledgeable source in whatever topic that they're talking about. So if you feel, if somebody's listening to this right now, if you're listening and you're thinking that you may not know a lot about a lot of things, but you know more than the average person about one particular topic, then there are people that will learn and benefit from the knowledge that you have to share. But you are not going to benefit anybody by keeping that shit to yourself. So get out there and get on a podcast or do whatever and get your freaking message out there and be heard, and get a hold of Jeremy. How can they go do that?
If they want to check out the company, we're over at commandyourbrand.com, and we are the PR firm for the podcast space. We'll help you get out there in the right way. Also, I have a book coming out in June that I am super excited about. It's called Unremarkable to Extraordinary, and it takes a look at some of the biggest things I've learned from people like a four-time Indy 500 champion, former CIA director, and a lot of things that I've learned from them around what it takes to, you don't have to start out incredible, but what it takes out to become incredible. And you can get that over, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, anywhere books are sold. It's available for pre-order, and that's called Unremarkable to Extraordinary.
Unremarkable to Extraordinary. I love that. I love that title.
Thank you.
That's heavy. That's heavy. Jeremy, Ryan Slate, first Jeremy on the podcast. Possibly the last, we'll see. But Jeremy, great to have you, man.
Hey, thanks for having me, man. It's a lot of fun.